Welcome to Rail Lines and Mines. On today's show, the story of Marvel.
We're here at the mine site at Marvel, Alabama in Bibb County, and have with us today Mr. Marshall Goggins, who's going to be our tour guide. And Marshall brings a lot of information to share. He grew up here. His dad worked for the Road and Coal Company, who operated the mine here at Marvel, and he lived here till he was 13 years old and left in 1951. So he's got a lot to tell us.
The Marvel mines were massive, and they were very unique. The portals for mines 1 and 2 were located side by side, but they were mining different coal seams. Mine number 3 was a mile or so east of mines 1 and 2.
One of the things that's so interesting to me about this site is that where we're standing is the mine opening, and then behind us, which would be generally to the south and southwest, the actual mining occurred underground as far as 2 miles away?
A good 2 miles, maybe a little further than 2 miles. It went out up under Eddingstown.
Mm-hmm.
Matter of fact, it went almost to the Shelby County line over here.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so then from here, as you described, the tramway went back and went 1,000 or so feet to the next ridge, which we'll go to later in the day. And then up there was all the what do you call it, the top house?
Top house, yeah.
And that's where they unloaded the tram cars, and then from there the coal kind of went down through the plant,
yeah.
And the plant will be stacked up on the far side of that ridge and eventually got to the railroad. And so when were these mines opened originally?
1906.
1906. And then they operated until when?
Mr. Roden operated until 1951, and then there was a couple of his foremen that had worked under Mr. Roden's leases that operated the mine pulling pillows out of this mine here, number 2 mine. And he operated till somewhere around 1953, and then all operations ceased, and then all the equipment was drawn out and pulled out of the mine and sold.
And so when your family left was 1951?
Yeah, 51. I was in the mining industry for 29 years.
And what did you actually do with Southern Coal?
I was in quality control.
Okay. So you were the guy that kind of judged what kind of coal was coming out of the mines, what they were buying?
I went in the mines. They called us inspectors one time, company inspectors. And we'd go and see what they were doing. We had contracts that were cost-plus contracts.
I see.
And I would go in the mine, and if I saw waste, then that reflected on how much the coal cost us. And then I would call it to their attention that, there's too much waste going on here. Yeah.
And I guess the power company had contracts to buy coal from different mines all over the area, so you got to see a lot of the different mines.
Oh, I've been in, I guess, practically in the past, especially the past 25 years, I guess every mine that's around here.
Well, that's great.
It's been in operation in the past 25 years.
Marshall, tell us what we're looking at, this big chunk of concrete.
Well, this is one of the footings for the viaduct that went from the top house to number 1 and number 2 mine.
So behind us, off to my right and behind Marshall, was the mine opening where we were standing a few minutes ago, and we've hiked down in the hollow and we're starting up the other side, headed toward the actual mine plant. And so this footing then supported the steel superstructure of the viaduct that carried the mine cars back and forth across this hollow. And it was 40, 50 feet high?
Every bit of it, if not more than that. I was probably close to 60 foot high at the deepest point.
Now, you were telling us that your dad played a part in taking this down, right?
My dad cut this trestle down with a cutting torch.
Is that right? So that would have been about what year?
It was along about 53, 54, after all operations ceased in mining, and Roden was getting rid of everything down here.
So they probably would have torn that down and sold it for scrap
iron, yeah.
Marvel had 3 mines. Mine number 3 used a dinky, which was a very small steam engine.
So then the track would have curved around to my left and ended up going parallel to this road. And how far to number 2 is it? I mean number 3 mine.
Roughly a mile and a half.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you could have walked right up the Dinky line and gotten to the number 3 opening, which was separate from the 2 that we've looked at over there. All right. And then up here on top, off to my left on the left side of the road as we're looking, there were some buildings up here. Do you remember about those?
There's a concrete slab up there remaining now. That was the blacksmith shop.
Okay. That was important.
Across from that was what they called the dinky shed.
Okay.
Where they would winter the dinky. They'd put it in there and kept heat in there so the water wouldn't freeze up on it.
Okay. Well, the blacksmith shop must have been a mighty important place.
Oh, it was. They made everything in there.
And you couldn't just send to Sears and Roebuck and get a new one, could you?
Right. I guess they made pretty much everything except for the wheels on the cars.
I remember an old friend of mine years ago who was then in his 90s, an engineer, and he said on a big site like this, the blacksmith shop was the blacksmith was the most important guy, because if it broke and he couldn't fix it, everything just stopped. So Marshall, we're standing sort of in the middle of all this plant. We're not at the middle level, or I guess we're at the next to the lowest level. Below us was the main line of the railroad. Above us was a spur track. So what's going on right in here where we are on this level?
Well, this level that we're currently standing on is where they had tables to recover the ultra-fine coals. A brand name of the table is Deister. There's other brands, but they all work in the same manner.
So this pit with the sloping sides would have probably been full of a mix of fines and water.
Yeah.
And the fines would settle to the bottom, and then the bucket would dredge it up.
Well, not necessarily. They would maybe try to keep it mixed up.
Oh, okay.
The fines, because if it gets settled, you can't get it.
Okay.
So if you keep it in the water, and the buckets has screens in them, and then the water will drain out as it's going up.
Oh, okay. So they're not really buckets; they're more like sieves on a chain.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And then these footings that we see all around us, like, well, they're footings.
Well, I mean, it was massive in there. It had lots of steel in that thing.
So the shaker or the washer tables were on these things?
They were higher up than I guess they were on piers a little higher, metal supports higher than that. But as I recall, we came in, we went up a little small flight of stairs. These highest piers here could have been, as I recall, would have been maybe along about the floor.
Yeah.
And then you walk through here, and then as you walk to the other side here, there was a bridge, a catwalk. That went across, and actually it went on across all this here. And there was a catwalk that went over into the boiler over there.
Okay. So in the distance behind us in the trees was the boiler building or the boiler house.
Right.
And then this great big massive wall behind us that's, gosh, what, 30 feet tall. What do you think that was?
It was some kind of a cold storage. It had to be. They have 3 openings on, they got 3 tunnels going up in there, and they've got 3 portholes for a product of some sort to fall through there. So it had to be coal.
So the coal started way up at the top of the hill in the head house and worked its way down through a series of bins. They could have loaded it into rail cars, or it could have come down into this big structure and then be pulled out of these tunnels on the bottom and washed.
The finer stuff could have been put in there, and then once it got in there and they got it out, then water could have been introduced into it, and possibly that may be this tank over here where it was introduced to it, and then it was picked up. They probably had some kind of a rake in that thing, what they call a rake, to keep the fines in suspension.
Yeah.
And then they could pump it over here and get it across the tables to get the coal removed out of it.
Now, what would they do with the real fine coal?
They could blend it in if they had a steam coal order or something like that. They could blend some of that in.
Because I think now, don't they use real fine pulverized coal for real modern boilers?
Well, they don't like that. Nowadays, they don't like lots of real fine coals because it creates a handling problem.
I see.
And usually contracts on fine coals is no more than 10%, quarter by zero.
Okay. Well, then, in the level up above us where the railroad cars were loaded, those were big chunks of coal.
Yeah, those would have been like egg lump,
Egg and lump, nut.
Those type coals there, yeah.
And those would have been used for what?
Well, like say like in Birmingham where they used stoker boilers to stoke a boiler with like the little lumps like say 1.5 inches by say 3/4 to 1.5 inches, something like that. They mined it by cutting and drilling, manually drilling most of the time. They had what they called a breast auger to shoot. That was in latter days. Now earlier days they still used a breast auger and they didn't have anything to undercut with. And then they came along with a cutter, a duckbill they called it, a duckbill cutter, and they'd undercut the coal and then they'd go in and drill it. And then they would load it with blasting powder, black powder at the time I think it was, and they would shoot it just enough to break it loose. They didn't try to tear it up. They broke it so they'd get all the lumps that they could get, so they didn't come up with a bunch of fine. And from there, it got loaded on the cars. It came outside to the top house. They had a dumping device. The cars came up. The front of the cars had a hinge on the front of the car. The very end of the car was a door, so to speak, with channel bars coming back to mid-car, and when the car dumped, there was a little hook on the front of the car. When the car would rake over, it'd lift that front door open, and the coal would fall out, and then it'd go across the screen to screen out the finer stuff, and whatever they predetermined, what size they wanted to keep on the upside. And then from there, they could get up here to where it goes into loading the cars and screen it on down, go through a series of screens like egg or like nut, and say egg, and then 2 or 3 different sizes of lump. And then all of them would have to go into different bins.
So they'd let gravity do part of the work,
right, yeah.
And then the screens would be set up in different levels. So the big stuff would be held off the top, and then a little bit smaller, and then down at the bottom end of the system, you get the stuff we were talking about below down here that would go into the water.
And that the same thing applies nowadays. Only they don't fool with the big lumps. They got stuff that say maybe 3 inches or something like that. And it goes through, anything goes through a 3-inch screen, then there's another little smaller screen, so it's got 1.5 inch, 2-inch opening in it. And it goes through that, and it goes on to a fine mesh, I think it's 20 mesh. And anything that falls through that 20 mesh screen, it goes into a frothing tank where they mix it with the water, and then that's when they put it through the plant where it has tables in it to wash it like that.
I see.
Yeah. Now today's mine there again, it's going to have more rock in it, so that it's going to they're going to separate the bigger rock out of it as they go there. But back in the days of this, I mean, they pretty much had all the rock out of it they could get out of it. And when it went on the rail car, they didn't,
What you got?
All they had to process was the fine stuff. The lumpier stuff, they were able to screen out everything. They would pick up some occasional pieces of rock, but when they loaded it, they made sure that they didn't get rock in it. I mean, I'm not sure that it happened here, but some of the mines in the olden days, they had what they called a picker outside.
I've seen pictures of that. Often used boys to do that on picking tables, out the slate.
But I mean, even to some of the cars, that as soon as they came out of the mine, they would have a tag on them. And that tag was assigned to a fella underground that loaded that car. And they had a peck bucket.
Oh, I see.
And if they picked as much as a peck bucket of rock,
too much,
out of that car of coal, he didn't get paid for that loading that car of coal.
So it sounds like part of the trick down when they were actually removing the coal down in the mine was, with that powder, you didn't want to blow it up too fine, or you'd spend all day loading the car.
Frack it, so to speak, so it would break apart.
If the pieces were too big, you'd break your back picking them up.
I mean, in the earlier days, nobody at all wanted fine coal. And then a little bit later on, say in the late 40s, somewhere along in there, U.S. Steel and people like that began to use some of the fine coals for using for coking coals then.
Okay.
Because it would coke all right.
Well, do you know, was coal here used for coking or just steam coal?
I imagine some of it probably used for coking. I couldn't say for sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
But I would think some of it was because, of course, back in those days, sulfur content didn't really mean anything. And the two seams that they mined here, the Clark, the Clark and the Golson. Golson being on the top, the Clark, I believe I'm right on that, being on the bottom, the upper and lower Clark, Golson and upper Clark and then the lower Clark. Now, I may have that backwards there.
We'll forgive you.